A bruised 7-year-old boy grabbed the leather vest of a hardened Hell's Angel and whispered 5 words that stopped time. No one believes me either. It started as a desperate plea in a dusty diner, but it unearthed a town's darkest secret and ignited a war nobody saw coming. The sun was baking the asphalt of Highway 99 into a shimmering mirage when Jax Henderson pulled his Harley-Davidson into the gravel lot of a roadside diner on the outskirts of Fresno. Jax wasn't a man who blended in. Standing 6'3" with a chest like a barrel, his arms were sleeves of ink, and the iconic winged death's head of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club was proudly emblazoned across the back of his leather cut. He was a patched member of the Oakland Charter, a man whose reputation was built on closed mouths, heavy hands, and fiercely protecting his own. He walked into the diner, the heavy thud of his boots cutting through the low hum of the ceiling fans. Trailing behind him were 2 of his brothers, Tommy O'Connor, a wiry mechanic with a razor-sharp grin, and Big Dave, a man who looked exactly like his name implied. They slid into a corner booth, ordering black coffee and burnt toast. It was a Tuesday afternoon, quiet and unremarkable. Until Jax noticed the boy. He was sitting 3 booths down, small enough that his feet dangled a good 6 inches above the linoleum floor. He looked about 7 years old. He was nursing a glass of tap water, staring a hole through the table. What caught Jax's eye wasn't the boy's ragged thrift store t-shirt, or the dirt smudged across his cheek. It was the sharp yellow-purple blooming of a fading bruise wrapping around the kid's left forearm. It was the grip of an adult hand, unmistakable to anyone who knew what violence looked like. Jax caught the eye of the waitress, an older woman named Brenda who looked like she'd spent 20 years pouring coffee and swallowing sighs. "What's the story there?" Jax grunted, nodding subtly toward the kid. Brenda wiped the counter, her mouth tightening. "He's on the city council. The police just wave it off. Tell me the boy is clumsy." The Hells Angels lived by a strict code, and while they were outlaws to the rest of the world, Cadow. Jax grunted in acknowledgement, but when he stood up 10 minutes later to step outside for a cigarette, he felt a slight trembling tug on his leather cut. He looked down. Leo was standing there, up close. The kid looked even more fragile, his hazel eyes wide and swimming with a terrifying mix of profound fear and desperate courage. He didn't flinch at the sight of the giant biker. "Are you bad guys?" Leo asked, his voice barely a whisper, trembling over the roar of a passing semi-truck. Jax paused, the unlit cigarette hanging from his lips. He looked down at the boy, then knelt, his leather creaking, bringing himself eye level with the child. Depends on who you ask, kid. Why? Good, Leo breathed out, looking over his shoulder toward the diner window before stepping closer. Because I need a bad guy. The teachers. Leo's lip quivered, but he bit it hard, refusing to cry. I told them Richard hurts me. I told them about the others. No one believes me. The boy looked at the patches on Jax's chest, tracing the lettering with his eyes. You're Hell's Angels. My stepdad said you're monsters at my house. What others, Leo? Jax asked, his voice dropping into a low, steady rumble. Leo reached up and pulled down the collar of his t-shirt. Behind his left ear, hidden by his messy brown hair, was a small, perfectly healed burn mark. But it wasn't a random burn. It was a shape. A tiny, crude brand of a diamond with a line through it. There are 3 other kids in the basement, Leo whispered, tears finally spilling over his lashes. They have this mark too. Richard says I'm getting mine tonight, before the big trucks come to take us away. This was something organized, something systemic. Human trafficking hiding in plain sight, operating out of a quiet suburban home under the protection of a corrupt local government. Just then, the diner door jingled open. A tall man in a crisp polo shirt and expensive slacks stepped out. His smile was perfectly practiced, but his eyes were entirely dead. Richard Davies. Leo, Richard said, his tone dripping with fake warmth. Time to go home, buddy. Stop bothering the gentleman. Jack stood up slowly, towering over Richard by 4 inches. He didn't step out of the way immediately. He looked Richard dead in the eye, memorizing the man's face, smelling the expensive cologne masking the stench of something rotten. He wasn't bothering me, Jax rumbled. Richard's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, intimidated by the sheer mass of the Hell's Angel, but his arrogance quickly recovered. Well, we have a big night ahead. Come on, Leo. Leo's eyes darted to Jax one last time, a silent, agonizing plea before he lowered his head and followed his stepfather to a gleaming black SUV. Jax watched the taillights fade onto the highway. He tossed his unlit cigarette onto the gravel and crushed it beneath his heel. When he walked back into the diner, Tommy and Big Dave took one look at his face and set their coffee mugs down. The Hells Angels didn't call the police. The police, as Leo had pointed out, were the ones returning him to the fire. Instead, Jax relied on a different kind of network. By 6-7 p.m., Big Dave had made 3 phone calls to affiliates in the Central Valley, pulling property records and background checks that no standard citizen could access so quickly. Richard Davies wasn't just a city councilman, he was the director of a private, high-end foster placement program that received massive state funding. To the public, he was a saint, taking in the state's most difficult children. Behind closed doors, according to the whispers in the criminal underbelly Dave dug up, Richard was the local linchpin for a highly organized smuggling ring. They moved weapons and narcotics, but their most lucrative cargo was human. They used the kids as mules, Jax, Tommy said, looking at the glowing screen of his burner phone in the dark corner of their motel room. Or worse. They ship them out through the ports in Oakland or down to Mexico. Nobody looks for them because they're runaways from a troubled youth program. Leo said the trucks are coming tonight, Jax replied, strapping a heavy hunting knife to his belt and throwing his leather cut over his shoulders. We don't have time for a summit. We do this now. At 11:20 p.m., the affluent, manicured neighborhood of Maple Drive was dead quiet. The houses sat far back from the street, shielded by heavy oak trees and iron gates. Richard Davies' house was a sprawling 2-story colonial that reeked of old money. Jax and Tommy parked their bikes 3 blocks away to avoid the noise, slipping through the shadows of the neighboring yards. The air was thick with the smell of cut grass and jasmine, a sickening contrast to the vile reality hidden within the walls. They approached the side of the house. Jax knelt by a low basement window, obscured by a line of hydrangeas. He pressed his face against the cold glass. The room was dimly lit by a single bulb. Inside, the scene made Jax's stomach violently churn. 3 children, none older than 10, were huddled on cots in the corner, staring blankly at the wall. They looked hollowed out, and in the center of the room stood Leo, crying silently, while a man in a surgical mask prepared a small blowtorch and a metal iron. But it was the third man in the room that made Jax freeze. He was leaning against the concrete wall, counting a thick stack of $100 bills. He wore a uniform. It was the local chief of police. The very man sworn to protect the city was collecting his cut for looking the other way. Son of a bitch, Tommy hissed over Jax's shoulder, seeing the police chief. This goes all the way up. We breached this house. It's not just a rescue. We're declaring war on the local brass. I don't care if it's the governor in there. Jax growled, his eyes locked on Leo. The kid was terrified, yet he stubbornly kept his head up, scanning the dark windows, hoping, waiting for his bad guy. Jax pulled a heavy cloth-wrapped crowbar from his jacket. You take the front door, Tommy. Cut the power from the main box on your way. You have 30 seconds. Tommy nodded, melting into the shadows. Jax counted the seconds in his head. The tension was a living thing, coiling in his chest. 28. 30. A muffled shout echoed from the basement. He dove through the shower of glass, landing heavy but balanced on the concrete floor just as flashlights clicked on inside the room. "What the hell?" Richard screamed, fumbling in the dark. The beam of the police chief's flashlight hit Jack's, illuminating the winged death's head on his chest. For a split second, the room stood perfectly still. To the corrupt men in that basement, the Hell's Angel looked like the Grim Reaper himself stepping out of the shadows. Before the chief could unholster his weapon, Jax lunged forward, grabbing the man by the throat and slamming him against the concrete wall with enough force to crack the plaster. The chief slumped, out cold. The man with the branding iron swung blindly in the dark. Jack sidestepped, catching the man's arm, twisting it sharply until a sickening snap echoed through the room. The man wailed, dropping the iron to the floor. Richard was backing away, holding Leo in front of him like a human shield, a small silver pistol pressed desperately to the boy's temple. "Back off, biker!" Richard stammered, his polished facade entirely stripped away, revealing the pathetic, trembling coward underneath. "You have no idea who you're messing with." "I'll kill him." Leo wasn't crying anymore. The boy looked past the gun, his eyes locking on Jax's face in the dim light. He gave a tiny, almost imperceptible nod. "You're right, Richard," Jax said, his voice a terrifying, dead calm as he took a slow step forward. "I don't know who I'm messing with. But you're about to find out exactly who I am." The basement was suffocatingly hot. The air thick with the metallic tang of fear and the ozone smell of the shattered light bulb. Richard's finger twitched on the trigger, his panicked breaths whistling through his teeth. He held Leo tight against his chest, the small silver pistol trembling against the boy's temple. Jax didn't blink. He kept his hands low, open, non-threatening, but his muscles were coiled like steel springs. He needed a distraction. Just a fraction of a second. It was Leo who provided it. The 7-year-old who had spent months enduring unimaginable terrors in this dark house suddenly stomped his heavy boot down on Richard's instep with every ounce of strength his small body possessed. Simultaneously, he clamped his teeth viciously into the fleshy part of Richard's forearm. Richard shrieked, a high-pitched sound of shock and pain, and his grip loosened. The pistol fired, the deafening crack echoing off the concrete walls, the bullet embedding itself harmlessly into the wooden rafters above. In the flash of the muzzle, Jax moved. He cleared the space between them in 2 massive strides. His left hand seized the barrel of the pistol, forcing it upward and wrenching it from Richard's grasp with a sickening crunch of breaking fingers. His right hand formed a fist the size of a cinder block, crashing into Richard's jaw with the force of a freight train. Richard's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the floor like a puppet with its strings cut. The boy buried his face in the heavy leather of the Hell's Angel's cut, his small hands gripping the fabric so tightly his knuckles turned white. He didn't cry. He just held on as if Jax were the only solid thing left in a crumbling world. "I got you, kid," Jax rumbled, his voice thick with an emotion he hadn't felt in decades. "I got you. It's over." From the top of the stairs, heavy boots thundered. Tommy kicked the basement door open, sweeping the area with a heavy flashlight and a drawn Colt M1911. "Clear upstairs," Tommy called out, his eyes adjusting to the carnage below. He stepped over the unconscious police chief and whistled low. "You work fast, brother." "Grab the chief's cuffs," Jax ordered, standing up and keeping Leo tucked behind his leg. Jax moved to the corner where the 3 other children were huddled, trembling uncontrollably. He took off his heavy leather cut, a sacred item in the club, something a member would fight to the death to protect, and gently draped it over the shoulders of a shivering little girl. "Tommy, get Big Dave on the horn," Jax said, his tone shifting into battle mode. "Tell him to pull the truck around. We need to get these kids out of—" Before Jax could finish his sentence, the grinding crunch of heavy tires rolling over gravel vibrated through the basement walls. It wasn't just one vehicle. It sounded like 3. Tommy ran to the shattered window, peering through the hydrangeas. "Jax," he whispered, the blood draining from his face. "We have a massive problem." Jax stepped to the window. 2 armored transport vans had pulled into the long driveway, flanking a black tactical SUV. Men were pouring out, but they weren't wearing the street clothes of low-level smugglers. They were wearing dark tactical gear, carrying assault rifles. Some wore balaclavas, others wore the muted badges of the county sheriff's specialized task force. "It's a dirty tactical squad," Tommy hissed, chambering around. Richard wasn't just paying off the local chief. The transport team is law enforcement. They were coming to collect the cargo. Jax looked back at the terrified children, then at the unconscious bodies of the men on the floor. If that tactical team breached the house and found 2 Hells Angels standing over a beaten police chief and a bruised city councilman, they wouldn't ask questions. They would execute everyone in the basement, including the kids, and blame the massacre on the bikers. Outside, a megaphone crackled to life, slicing through the quiet suburban night. "This is Deputy Griggs. To the individuals inside the residence, you have illegally breached a private home. We know you are armed. Come out with your hands empty, or we will neutralize the threat." "Neutralize?" Tommy scoffed, shoving a massive steel workbench against the reinforced oak door at the top of the stairs. "That's a nice way of saying leave no witnesses." Jax pulled his burner phone from his pocket. He had 1 bar of signal. He dialed a number he hadn't used in 3 years, praying the man on the other end was awake. "Iron Bill," a gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "Bill, it's Jax," he said, speaking quickly and quietly. "I'm in Fresno, Maple Drive. I've got 4 kids, a busted trafficking ring, a dirty police chief on the floor, and a heavily armed, corrupt task force outside about to breach." There was a pause on the line. Then the sound of a heavy sigh. I sighed. You always did hate the easy way out, Jax. How much time do you have? Maybe 5 minutes before they blow the door. Hold the line, brother, Bill said, his voice dropping an octave. We're already in the city. Jax hung up. He looked at Tommy. We hold them off. The sudden shattering of glass upstairs signaled the beginning of the raid. Tear gas canisters thumped onto the hardwood floors above, sending plumes of caustic white smoke leaking down the stairwell. Heavy boots hit the floorboards. The tactical team was sweeping the house, moving with brutal, terrifying efficiency. Down! Jax yelled to the kids, pushing them under the thickest part of the stairwell, shielding their bodies with his own massive frame. The handle of the basement door rattled violently. When it didn't give, a heavy battering ram slammed into the wood. They're coming through, Tommy yelled, taking aim at the center of the door. Boom! The door cracked down the middle, the workbench screeching backward across the linoleum. Through the gap, the barrel of a tactical shotgun appeared, sweeping the room. Fire! Jax roared. Tommy unloaded 3 rounds through the door, forcing the attackers to fall back into the hallway with shouted curses. But it was only a temporary reprieve. A stun grenade bounced down the wooden stairs, clattering against the concrete right at Jax's feet. Jax kicked it toward the far corner of the room, throwing his hands over Leo's ears. A blinding flash and a deafening concussive roar shook the foundation of the house. Ears ringing, vision blurred, Jax blindly raised his weapon toward the stairs. It wasn't the coordinated, aggressive barking of an assault squad anymore. It was panic. Through the ringing in his ears, Jax heard a sound that made the hair on his arms stand up. It started as a low, guttural vibration, shaking the earth beneath the house. It grew louder, a mechanical, thundering roar of heavy, unbaffled exhaust pipes. It wasn't the police. It was the cavalry. Outside, the manicured lawns of Maple Drive were being torn to shreds. More than 50 Harley-Davidsons had turned onto the street, riding shoulder to shoulder, their high beams cutting through the tear gas leaking from the house. It was a terrifying, awe-inspiring mobilization. Led by Iron Bill, the president of the Oakland Charter, patched members from 3 different chapters had swarmed the property, completely encircling the tactical vans and the corrupt deputies. Deputy Griggs, standing behind the tactical SUV, dropped his megaphone. He watched in horror as burly leather-clad men dismounted, carrying baseball bats, heavy chains, and an assortment of firearms. They didn't rush in blindly. They moved with a disciplined, terrifying quiet, forming an impenetrable wall of leather, denim, and steel around the property perimeter. Inside the house, the tactical team abandoned the basement door. The sound of heavy boots echoed as they scrambled toward the front and back exits, realizing they were completely trapped. "Put the guns down, Badge!" Iron Bill's voice boomed over the idling roar of the motorcycles. He stepped into the glow of the headlights, a massive, scarred man who looked like he had stepped out of a nightmare. "You're trespassing on club business tonight." Bill didn't flinch. He just smiled. A cold, humorless expression. "You open fire, Griggs, and none of you make it to the sidewalk. Now, we know what's in that basement. And we know who you're working for. Put the guns down. Inside the basement, Jax pushed the shattered door aside and led Tommy and the kids up the stairs. The heavy smoke was clearing. As they stepped out onto the front porch, the sight was breathtaking. The corrupt tactical team had surrendered, their weapons kicked away, forced to their knees on the lawn by the sheer, overwhelming numbers of the Hells Angels. Big Dave stepped out from the shadows of the hydrangeas, casually tossing a pair of zip ties to another biker. Took you boys long enough? Dave grinned. Jax walked down the porch steps, carrying Leo in his arms. The other children clung tightly to Tommy and Dave. Jax walked straight up to Deputy Griggs, kneeling down so they were face to face. You thought nobody was looking, Jax said quietly, his voice cutting through the rumbling engines. You thought you could operate in the dark. But you forgot something. We own the dark. The sound of sirens finally wailed in the distance. But it wasn't the corrupt local dispatch. Iron Bill had made a phone call of his own to a federal contact in San Francisco who had been trying to build a case against Richard Daly's trafficking ring for 2 years, stymied by local interference. The FBI was minutes away. Time to ride, brothers. Bill commanded, looking at the approaching red and blue lights. The Hells Angels didn't stick around for the police, federal or otherwise. They had done the heavy lifting. The feds could do the paperwork. The bikers began mounting up, the roar of 50 engines drowning out the sirens. Jax set Leo down on the bumper of the nearest tactical van, right next to where the FBI would find him. He knelt in front of the boy one last time. Leo's face was smeared with dirt, soot, and tears, but his eyes were entirely different now. The profound, haunting fear had been replaced by a quiet, fierce spark. Jax reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, heavy silver ring cast in the shape of a winged skull. He pressed it into Leo's small palm, closing the boy's fingers around it. You keep this hidden, Jax instructed, his voice gruff but infinitely gentle. If anyone ever tries to hurt you again, if anyone ever makes you feel like you're alone in the dark, you show them this. You tell them you have a whole army of bad guys looking out for you. Leo looked at the ring, then up at Jax. He threw his arms around the massive biker's neck, hugging him with desperate, crushing gratitude. Thank you, he whispered into the leather. I believe you. Jax patted the boy's back awkwardly, clearing a sudden, unfamiliar tightness from his throat. He stood up, giving the kid a final nod before walking over to his Harley. As the FBI tactical vehicles swarmed the street, screeching to a halt to find the corrupt officers bound on the lawn and the trafficking victims safely waiting, the roar of the Hells Angels was already fading into the night, disappearing down Highway 99 like ghosts. This the tactic Davies, the local police chief, Deputy Griggs, and dozens of associates were indicted on federal racketeering and human trafficking charges. The story made national headlines, though the official report conveniently omitted exactly who had subdued the heavily armed tactical team and rescued the children. Leo was placed in a specialized, highly vetted trauma recovery home hundreds of miles away, far from the reach of the corrupt county system. He was safe. He was healing. But sometimes, when a loud, rumbling motorcycle passed by the windows of his new home, Leo would reach into his pocket, his thumb brushing over the cold, heavy silver of a winged skull ring, knowing with absolute certainty that the monsters in the dark were real, but so were the men who hunted them. A desperate 7-year-old's leap of faith proved that a hero isn't defined by a badge, but by the lines they refuse to cross. Against unimaginable darkness, an outlaw's fiercely guarded code became a child's ultimate shield, reminding us that even society's perceived monsters can be guardian angels in disguise,